I'm very glad to be here and to join in congratulating SCORE on its 25 years of survival. And it's always been a great pleasure to be involved in intellectual exchanges here. I've been here, as Neil said, many times, and have learned a lot and enjoyed it. Today I'm going to talk about organization and organization theory with something of a historical perspective over the past and the present and speculation about the future. I'm talking both about organization and organization theory. And it is a strange field in the sense that its object of study is in part constituted by the analyses involved. Organization in the real world has always been an imagined set of structures, theorized by the same people who then, those of us who pretend to study it. There's a peculiar problem there. But it means that in discussing the historical perspective I want to bring, you're talking both about the evolution of organizations as imagined structures in the world and the theorists who imagine them. It's historically, in other words, more conditioned than most other areas of social research. That's a central feature of it. That's a background comment. I would start by beginning before the word organization became the conventional word for what we do. In the late 19th century and the early 20th century, the vision of the rationally organized society got intensified. It's one theme that follows from the Enlightenment, and what's called the Enlightenment discovery of society. One particular theme in that tradition is the envisioned picture that our society is a machine. It works, it functions. It does not depend on a culture. Culture is what we used to have in superstition before the Enlightenment. Or culture is what the savages had. We don't. We have a real system. That fantasy which runs through the whole modern period lies at the background of the imagination that society could be rationally organized. The social form, bureaucracy. I will make a distinction between that and modern organization. A bureaucracy is a machine, a servo mechanism, doing the bidding of a sovereign of some kind, an owner, but most commonly the state. Unlike modern organization, a bureaucracy pretends not to make decisions. It reflects the decisions of a sovereign, an external sovereign. And that picture that you could produce a social mechanism that carried out the will of some sovereign was very central in late 19th century developments around the world associated with the expansion of the organized state. Was a fantasy widely held. Max Weber, coming from a pre-revolutionary context, thought it was an iron cage, an oppressive. In France, you had Henri Fayol, and in America, you had Frederick Taylor, were post-revolutionary countries, and they thought it was a good idea. But Weber and Fayol or Taylor, we're talking about the same thing. The rationally organized structure carrying some sort of central decision. And the image that we all grew up with, which has almost disappeared from many people here seem to me a little bit young. It used to be a thing called the organization chart, with something, all vertical lines carrying what Weber called imperative authority. Nothing else. Just a simple organization chart. And that was what the world should look like, or would look like. And that was still alive as a picture of the ideal organization when I was a student. Questions arose about it. Some things didn't fit. Famously, in the 1930s, Burley and Means noticed that, well, the managers in these organizations make a lot too many decisions. And the owners, who are supposed to be sovereign, are not. So that was one set of questions. Other set of questions arose from the human relations tradition, which pointed out that the people at the bottom of this organization chart are human individuals with some of the crankiness characteristic of humans and some of the extra supra-rational qualities. And that was an issue. And then more famously, Chester Barnard, again working in the American context, imagined that the organization chart isn't how it works. It's really a system of cooperation and consent and so on. It depends on all sorts of a fabric of legitimacy to make it go. In this vision, and Arthur Stinchcombe pointed this out many years later, there seemed to be, following the late 19th century, it made sense, the assumption that everybody involved and all the people playing roles in this system had at the very minimum mass education. They were all literate and had been trained to sit for long periods of time in classrooms like this without moving, and could therefore cooperate in a rationally organized structure. That appeared to be the assumption, and Weber himself had pointed out the difficulty of organizing pre-literate peasants who would go to work until they had enough money to buy the thing they wanted, and then they would go home and they would stay home. And they hadn't learned the principle of showing up to the classroom or the factory. So that Stinchcombe was quite right, that there's an assumption here in which modern society had enacted itself by constructing not real people, peasants, but students, workers, citizens, persons. And that there was a fundamental cultural dependence there that the theorists of the time didn't confront very well. Well, this whole synthesis broke down as a result of World War II and its aftermath. Some of the destruction was intellectual research, but before saying that, I need to remind you of the intensity of the faith. That Weber really thought it was an iron cage. We now, looking back, know that it was a fantasy, that it didn't work that way. And it was a dream world. But everyone in the 20s and 30s, I tended to think this was the future. Obviously, the communists had one version, various fascists had others, and the liberals had others, but everybody had that organized vision. So that Robert Merton, with whom I studied, in the 1930s wrote a famous paper, The unanticipated consequences of purposive social action. He was wondering, what space is there left for a social scientist once rational organization has been achieved? Well, the function of the social scientist is to notice little glitches that happen. He took for granted that the world of bureaucratic organization was the future. But he thought, well, there's a room for sociologists to notice the little ways in which it doesn't work quite right. We now, obviously, have learned to be very skeptical about the rationality of purposive social action itself. But, he took that for granted, and he's sent his students out to find glitches in the machine. And his students, famously, Philip Selznick, Alvin Goldner, Peter Blau, they did that. In all those cases, however, they still thought that the main system, the organization chart, was the basic way in which things would work. But they could discover little difficulties. As an indicator of that, they used the word bureaucracy to describe it. But more questions came up in the 50s and 60s. And so just to see the intellectual history, there were more exceptions. There was one exception, the professional organizations, which don't look quite like bureaucracies. And they could be analyzed as mistakes, but that didn't work very well. Hospitals, universities, schools. That was one failure. Another failure was the empirical discovery of things come loose at the bottom. There is formal organization, that's the organization chart, and then there's this other stuff, informal organization. And that those are disconnected in some fashion. Then there's also a disconnection at the top. The Carnegie Mellon people, Simon, Sire, March, and others, that there are great limits to the rationality, the rational capacity of the people at the top of the organization chart. So things came loose, more and more kinds of research made its living by showing disconnections. Formal, informal organization, the limits of bounded rationality, the staff line issue, I forgot to mention that one, that more and more the organizations had, in addition to that pure organization chart, there are these extra people who report to the president. They do research, or they manage special functions, human relations, or whatever. And that you can't describe their relation to the system with the concept of imperative authority. It's a dotted line that connects them to the work going on. And gradually, organization charts began to look really ugly, with lots of dotted lines. And sometimes vertical lines, authority lines connecting a given role with two superiors, which was thought to be a great sin. And more and more of this appeared. So that's the intellectual history of which people became more and more critical of the faith in rationalized bureaucracy. And that led to a breakdown in around 1970 or so, 65, in the faith. But I need to tell a parallel history about the real world of, quote, organization, in which similar changes were occurring. In the aftermath of World War II, and the decolonization of the world, there was an enormous expansion in forms of authority that lay outside the classic organization chart. And we get the emergence of the world of organizations as we now know it. And that is accompanied by the use of the word organization instead of the word bureaucracy. The discovery is that these are social systems, that the sovereign does not lie outside. The sovereign is in part internal, and they are decision-making entities. So in the sense in which a bureaucracy pretends not to be a decision-making entity, an organization pretends to be one. And in our research, there are people who take that seriously. But it is a pretense. It is a structure. So at this point, we get a shift later summarized by Mills and Tristan and by other people, the shift to the organization as actor. In the previous world, the actor was the sovereign, and the organization was an instrument. In this world, the organization is a decision-making entity. It acquires its decision-making capacity from external legitimacy, but internal participants who themselves are modern individuals. And after World War II, you have an explosion in pictures of human rights, human capacities, which still goes on to our own time, probably intensified in the neoliberal period. But there's a faith that individuals are actors and are decision makers. And the organization is an assembly of their capacities and their legitimate authority. This is another factor involved, is the weakening of the sovereignty of the national state, the charisma of the national state, which becomes increasingly itself an organization or a set of organizations. So we have empowered people, and part of that is an ideological effort to imagine social control in the world in which the empires have broken down and in which statism is not legitimate. So you get the myth of the individual as they have the capacity to make decisions and to join together. There's also the sense that they're embedded, they're capable of rational analysis of the world, and the world is a scientifically rational place. So you have an explosion of the sciences, especially the social sciences. You have an explosion in the imagined capacity of people operating in universalistic norms to collaborate, to form what we now call organizations and to assemble the magic of decision-making processes. And that's the birth of the modern idea of the organization, which is still with us. In the real social world, this new synthesis in the post-World War II world was institutionalized in the form of the massive expansion of education. So as Stockholm tells us that the traditional bureaucratic organization depended on mass education and literacy, the new organizational forms depend on an expanded picture of people and an expanded sense that they are, they possess the rationalized culture of science, and the world could be seen in this fashion. So this is just a summary. This is enrollments worldwide in higher education, and it's a stunning change over a very short period of time. There are other charts I won't bother you with that show it's an absolute worldwide change, and since it occurs in every country. Naturally, the poor countries start lower, but their growth rate is the same as rich countries, pretty much. So we moved from a world in which higher education was a kind of an exotic property of some cultural elites to a world in which, say, over 20% of a cohort is exposed to higher education now, maybe 25%. And that's worldwide. These are people, in other words, whose empowerment linked to an expanded rationalistic world makes them decision makers. So just to capture this, there are more students today in Algeria or Kazakhstan than there were in the whole world in 1900. It's a radical change in in this exploding system. These are now calculated, the percent of them that enroll in various substantive areas. And in the sciences expand along with the whole system. Those are the flat lines. The declining line is the famous decline of the humanities, which are linked to particularistic cultural claims or civilizational claims. And the rising line is us, although you may not have experienced it in your paycheck. The radical growth in most of that occurs in every social scientific field. Economics, yes, certainly, sociology, political science, psychology. It occurs even more rapidly in the applied social scientific areas, education, and especially relevant here, business schools, which explode around the world. And again, producing this huge population of people who are empowered as rational decision makers and empowered in a scientized world, so that their rationality occurs in the same lawful structure. Which means that you can assemble them in minutes and get an organization. They have the whole culture in common. They can assemble and shake hands, and they know the role structures that you could have. And they're the building blocks of a decision-making organization with management at its center. That's the world of modern organization, and it has expanded steadily by every measure since the whole period, since say 1960 or 70. And it expands even more rapidly, as you might imagine, in the neoliberal period, which further weakens the state and the old myths of more particularistic unities. So in the last 25 years, it's grown. All these measures, many of the measures show even more rapid growth. Enrollment in higher education is one of them. So if you allow me a footnote here, one of the reasons, goes back to my point about the reciprocal relation between organization theory and organization, one of the reasons SCORE has been so successful is that the world comes into line. And so there's all this stuff created by organization theory for the organization theorists to analyze. And so this is not to take away from the great intellectual achievements involved, but to note that part of it is that the world has been tamed and brought into line with these intellectual achievements. I showed the expansion of higher education. You should note that all the other levels of education expand too. I mean, primary education moves to universality, secondary education becomes universal in the developed world. And then you get this faith in the human capacity. So you get something to which the European Union is committed called lifelong learning, which means you're allowed to imprison yourself in classrooms for the rest of your life. And there are the heresies involved, so you can take courses in preparation for death too. I think they're non-credit by and large. Or if the credit is involved, it would be transcendental. And of course, as you know, lifelong learning extends early in life. There's faith in competence. And there are people who imagine that you would help solve the problem of social conflict in the world if you got pregnant women to play social studies lessons to their belly. And there are schemes of this kind. These are not built into the European Union's policies, but they're there in the world. They're there as capturing this imagined sense of the capacity of a human organized in a common cultural frame to move forward. So you get organization and this myth of human capacity to make collective decisions. You get it in every social sector, so that the state organizations are supposed to turn into organizations and stop being bureaucracies. Good luck, but that's what they're supposed to do. Private firms are supposed to be organizations. And then you have this huge world that we now call nonprofits, which translates older religious and charitable and educational arrangements and calls attention that they are organizations. This is surprising. And of course, you get a lot of reactionary complaints from older people who are not able to adapt, old doctors who really wanted to be doctors, not participants in a decision-making organization structure. And they complain. And professors complain a lot about the decline in that older substantive commitment. And sometimes it is surprising. So I just as a personal anecdote was my collaborator had to cancel a research meeting because she was the chairman of her religious congregation's committee to write a strategic plan. And, you know, I come from the old days where God had the plan and we worshipped. Now we have the plan and I don't know where God is. But we have strategic plan and committees. Empirically, you can find this just everywhere. And of course, the whole charitable structure turns into nonprofits. And you can now get a PhD in nonprofit management, meaning the management of what is sometimes nothing. So it's a spectacular set of social changes. And the storyline is they're all organizations now.